On this website, we often talk about innovation, but how do you monetize that innovation? And to find out less obvious ways you can do this, we're pleased to welcome Luke Hamm, who's the CEO of GovGrant. Hello, Luke.
Hi, Max. How you doing?
Very well, thank you.
Good.
So your company helps businesses monetize their innovation through R&D and tax credits and various government incentives. So why would a business need help with that?
The key thing is when we work with inventors in the wider space of software, but particularly around AI, most people don't realize what they're doing is as technically challenging as it is. People assume that they're in the AI ecosystem and everybody else is doing it, and it's just I'm doing a little bit different and I've got a different take on something, when actually when you stand back and you have an independence around what are you actually doing, what you are doing, what the industry is doing, tends to be research and development much wider. We never, for example, if you ask an engineer, use a different sector, for example, if you ask an engineer who's been in the same thing for 20 years, what do you do every day that's really challenging? The answer is, I've been doing it for 20 years. It's not challenging. I know what I'm doing now. But that's the point. How many people like that exist where they don't realize what they do on a daily basis is trying to push us forward? There's advancements. The definition of from HMRC around R&D isn't these big light bulb moments coming up with the next robot that's going to do everything. That's not it. It's not about white lab coats and all that good stuff. It's about the incremental improvements. And if you think about what incremental improvement looks like in the world of AI, it doesn't need to shift the world on its axis. It's those smaller steps that people sometimes get blinded by, but is hugely valuable.
All right. Well, that's certainly like a positive message. And in terms of AI adoption in the UK specifically, what kind of trends have you noticed?
I think one of the biggest trends is AI historically felt as if it became its own vertical, and people thought about AI as a vertical. And what we've now started to see within our client base, and we have clients ranging from startups, scale-ups, right the way up to FTSE 250 businesses, is that AI is becoming just part of the development roadmap. It's not sitting there thinking as this now needs to be a separate work stream that's everyone going to think about, that we're going to become an autonomous AI-led business. It's started to become far more in the general roadmap of many businesses and thinking about what are the things that we can practically do around AI and pushing on. It's almost that, the robotics, the automation, it's just another step forward. When you previously think about when people deployed CRM systems or whatever it might be, that felt 10, 20 years ago, that felt like a quantum leap forward. And now what you're thinking about is how do we just tweak the system instead of these big deployments? How do we do these little tweaks in the system and then thinking about AI as part of that solution?
And so dealing with AI, a lot of the applications are new and innovative, because obviously it might not be even as groundbreaking as CRM, but still, like people invent things on a daily basis. So what does that mean for the patent system, for example, and generally like intellectual property protection in this space?
Well, it's a really good question, and it's a space that needs to change, quite frankly, because there are lots and lots of excitement. There's lots of different funding mechanisms around creation of AI and AI solutions, but there's very little to do to support protecting those assets. And I hate the phrase protecting, because protection means you've got to go and fight someone. What people should think about is how do you use that as a value creator? What's the environment we need to think about when it comes to patents that allows that become a tool for collaboration and a tool that is genuinely value led? In the UK, if you tend to think about software patents, most people think it's a very difficult place to go and tread. Some, even the biggest businesses, will sit there and think this just feels too much hard work. And we need to change that perception. When you look at a global perspective of how patents are registered and the ability to think about commercializing your IP, and we use those languages quite consciously, When you take away that lens of protection when it comes to innovation, it allows you to think far more freely, and think about what assets you can create off the back of it, as opposed to what lawsuits you may face. So a good example would be, we tend to talk as a business, we tend to talk with our clients around understanding where they are when they think about patents and IP. Are they thinking about, this is the thing we need to absolutely get right? We need to make sure that we're going to define something new, and our playing field, no one else can come near. This is where we play. Good example would be Google's patents around their search engine technologies. They still are market leading, still very difficult to replicate. That's their field. When you think search engine, you think Google. You're right there. Now, in reality, there are not many people who can or will think like that. When you sit there and think, I'm now thinking about a world where I'm making incremental improvements, I'm not creating a brand new field. When you're creating a brand new field, absolutely, you want to think about every part of that field is yours. This is where you play, and this is where people need to play with you to get on. The reality is that people should start thinking about, is it the field I need, or is it a blade of grass I need? Does a blade of grass add just as much value to my business proposition and my value creator to client, to shareholders, to economic wealth, to job prosperity, whatever it might be that's important? You then start thinking in a far more focused, strategic way. The opportunity, I should say, with intellectual property is to change the conversation. It's to change the narrative away from, it's an interesting subject. If you speak to anyone, it might be someone brand new into the field, new entrepreneur, right up to someone who's been there, done that, got the t-shirt. When you talk about intellectual property, it can be really interesting. The first question that we'll get asked is, why was that patent successful? That's interesting. Tell me more about X, Y, and Z. And it's super interesting. Don't get me wrong. I can lose days on end just looking at things. But the reality is you've got an opportunity to be far more focused in the questions that you ask. Instead of being interested in the subject matter, you go, okay, here's the book of information, but what question do you need to answer from this? When you think about a question outcome-led approach to IP, we can really push the agenda on more. And we need to then push that and think about, how does an economic environment respond to that type of lens? And also, what does the government do to support that lens?
Exactly. Yes. So the role of government should not be understated. And so, for example, in the US and in China, these countries lead the world in AI. And over there, like the public sector is very interested in funding this revolution and bankrolling and huge amounts are being spent and it's just like and spending on AI by the US and Chinese governments is set to increase and is going to be like a massive thing going forward. So the UK government is obviously also offering funding for AI startups. So do you think, it does enough to keep us competitive? How do you see the role of government in this equation?
In a word, to answer your question, no, they're not doing enough. Simple as that. The movement into the high risk agency, the AIRA, is very interesting. The kind of moonshot agency is very useful from a research development perspective. And it's very likely that part of their agenda will include the moonshot AI type projects. But where we're failing is to show real signaling. And it's a really important thing. And hopefully, as we start to build back better from COVID, and also think about the opportunities that Brexit will give us. If you like Brexit, if you don't like Brexit, forget it for the moment. It's happened, and we need to understand what the opportunities are from it. The government has genuinely got a unique moment in time to think about, what sectors do we want to back? What technologies do we want to back? What creates future value? One of the real stick out numbers when you think about anything to do with innovation is what's referred to as the spillover effect. And the spillover effect is effectively, for the pound invested now by government, what does that mean in 10, 20, 30 years time? Forget the short-term recovery of situations, but that long-term prosperity. And that long-term prosperity comes from job creation, comes from future tax revenues of successful businesses, the ecosystems that created around it. So government needs to wind back and understand in our industrial strategy, and the industrial strategy was a really good piece of work, and it's probably going to be delayed, the review of it. But in that industrial strategy, we need to see clearer signalling of, as I said earlier, there are technologies that are not within verticals anymore. They are tools that are across our economy, and thinking about the deployment of support mechanisms that supports that move, that supports, as opposed to we're going to fund project 1, 2 and 3, to a situation where you're saying we want to back any business taking this subject matter seriously. And that's why R&D tax is a really good example of that. Doesn't matter what sector you sit in, if you're into the qualification, and government's got an opportunity to use current deployment mechanisms such as HMRC to think about how do we get the money to support these projects, to make sure that people really are invested, and actually becomes a slightly they share in the risk of it. You know, still deploying AI solutions and developing AI to the next level is not the easiest thing in the world, as you know. And businesses want comfort in that certainty. If you think about some of the deployment mechanisms of COVID support, it was quick, it was efficient, it was direct. And if there's any lessons we can learn of that, is when we sit there and signal, these are the things we want to do. AI, UK needs to be a destination for AI businesses. Guess what? We need to do it quickly, efficiently, in a focused way.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So do you think the first steps to this are sort of like, you know, like a PR campaign or more direct steps with funding, you know, like, so what do we need?
So it's a really good question. I'm slightly biased. I think when you've got certain projects and you have campaigns such as Innovate UK, and Innovate UK do a great job, however, it's wrapped in bureaucracy. It's very difficult sometimes to navigate through a path to get to those funding mechanisms. And it's a shame because so many good ideas potentially get left to one side because it's a competition. And if you're in a competition, it doesn't mean the runner-up is a bad idea. It's just that on your particular day, you didn't get to the finish line first. Now, that feels a missed opportunity, really does. And I would advocate that indirect forms of support potentially outweigh the direct forms of support, as opposed to the bureaucracy that can go with competition-led investment processes. Public, forget the private sector for the moment. We need to think about how does government, as I said just a minute ago, how does government turn that lens and think about, we've got this pot of money. You know, the UK is very, very clear how serious it takes R&D, 2.4% of gross domestic product, and wants to turbocharge it. 2.4, by the way, would still put us behind some of our European neighbours. We'd still be behind Germany, for example, when it comes to investment in R&D. So the question would be, does that go far enough? And if it doesn't go far enough, how do we turbocharge that investment? And you can understand when technologies touch businesses in very different ways, but the intent is still to move forward, it's far easier to understand that on a daily practical basis versus a competition-led product or project.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And the last question, a bit of a curveball. So last year, the US launched the National AI Initiative Office. Do you think we could use something like that in the UK? You know, like there are existing organizations, but how about a brand new one and dedicated specifically to AI?
It's a great question. My concern actually would be with that is it becomes too siloed again. It becomes, what does that scope of that industry look like? What does that remit look like? And yet again, we get wrapped up in a bureaucratic way. So agencies are good for signaling, like, as I said, the high end, the high risk, high strategy one. It's good for signaling, but what's the intent of it? I'll use the Intellectual Property Office as an example. We have an Intellectual Property Office with circa 600 employees. So it's a relatively big spend out of the government coffers. And you'd look in at that and think, wow, the UK takes IP really seriously if they're putting that sort of money into it. But we're behind the curve. So would a new agency around AI create the right signaling, or would it feel restrictive in its scope? Would it have to butt up against other government departments? and then you become this inter-battle of what agenda wins anyway. It feels like when we wrap up the subject of AI, it feels like we need to move back to the macro situation of it. Why is AI there? To move faster, quicker, better, to create value. That feels as if that's at the top level. That's at the very top table of economic strategy and what the government should be thinking about, as opposed to just this side agency that has to be effectively in the mix. What will it achieve would be my biggest question.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, I mean, we will see it because the US is doing it. So we will see, like a couple of years down the line, we will be able to sit down and look at the successes and failures, and that's great. Don't actually have to do it. All right, well, Luke Hamm, CEO of GovGrant, thank you very much. If people want to check out what you do and maybe ask a couple of questions, where should they go?
Sure. So the website's govgrant.co.uk. And as I said, we work with a number of businesses in the UK, over 1,000 businesses around their R&D tax and also their early stage intellectual property, right the way through to patent box. So yeah, delighted to work with any of your members.
Thank you very much.